Welcome. This is Possibilities. My name is Cecil Walker.
And I'm Adam Frower.
And for today, we are talking about perspective and how much power there can be in the perspective that you take. I guess just to generally start us off, Adam, what's the relevance of perspective? If I'm going through a hard time, if I'm dealing with something difficult, as people are when they come to therapy, why should I care about the perspective I take on the situation that I'm in?
Yeah, I think even in the way that you framed that question, there's something really valuable in the way that you said that. And you said, what difference does it make in the perspective I take? Which seems to infuse some agency in there, right? That there's a choice of I can perceive something one way, or I could perceive something another way, presumably maybe numerous ways. And so I think especially then also embedded in your question is like when somebody's dealing with something challenging or difficult, right? How do I use that agency, how to kind of influence the perspective that I have? And I think that's one of the things, I guess maybe if we back up one step and we say perspective is in some sense the lens with which you're looking at something. And therefore, if we buy into this idea of different lenses, then I have some choice over which one of those lenses, or maybe even filters is a better word, the filters that I'm going to look at things through. I think the reason that that's really important and valuable is that we could experience one event or one experience, and we can choose to look at it in various ways. And that will impact a lot of things. That would potentially impact our emotion, the way we feel about it. It would potentially impact our behavior. So what do we choose to do about it? It could also then influence our interactions with other people. So I think if we use choice wisely in perception, it could literally change our lives.
Yeah, I think that's such an interesting point, because it seems like a lot of the things that we find ourselves talking about in this programming is that there is agency to pick up in the ways that we're living our lives. And so for this to be just another way to introduce, here's how you have choice, here's how you have some control over your situation, I think that that's pretty impactful. What would you say then, that maybe I'm getting ahead of myself, but if someone is in a really, really tough spot and they don't feel like they have any agency at all, how do you get started on I'm going to take this perspective, I'm going to execute the choice that I have?
Yeah, I think one of the things I guess that I would add to that, or a caution, is that I don't think we're advocating for just put on, a false pretense of what's happening or ignore bad things that are happening. So I don't think that we're saying your perspective is ignore something. But I think what it comes down to, especially in solution-focused therapy, we oftentimes talk about versions of people, right? If the best version of you or the capable version of you showed up in a difficult situation, what would you notice? What would be different? And I think really that's the perspective that we're trying to take, is the situation itself doesn't change. You may still have to deal with hard things. You may still be experiencing negative impacts from other people or whatever. But it's about the perspective of what version am I going to be when I show up in this encounter? Do I want to be a brave version of myself? Do I want to be a kind version of myself? Do I want to be a thoughtful version of myself? Do I want to be a cowering version of myself? And I think we make choices all the time about how we're going to show up in a particular situation. And I think that, so I guess what I would say is the perspective that we're advocating isn't the perspective that you're going to have about something or about a situation, but it's a perspective that I have of myself. What am I bringing to this situation?
Yeah, that's fascinating. And I totally agree with that. But it sounds like what you're saying is that not only does perspective give you a sense of agency, but it also filters through the versions of yourself. And if you were to take a certain kind of perspective, that's allowing a certain version of you to show up. And maybe even the other way around, maybe if you had a certain version of you being realized, that version would have a particular perspective to take.
Yeah, it's almost like the chicken and the egg, right? Is it the version that's influencing the perspective, or is it the perspective that's influencing the version? And I think it could really go both ways.
Yeah.
But I think in both of those situations, which is what we kind of keep coming back to, is that there's agency, right? That I could choose to show up as a certain version of myself, or I could choose to view things in a particular way. And either way, it's going to influence both.
Yeah. I like the idea that it's synonymous like that. And I think it's a pretty common thing in therapy that people will say, well, if I woke up as my confident self, if I was, engaging in this situation as my confident self, I wouldn't see it as such and such type of way. I'd see this as an opportunity or something like that. I'd see it as, this is a chance for me to take on this task or do something different.
So I'm going to ask you a challenging question I think a lot of people ask or think about as they come to therapy, especially people who are who've had a big trauma or who have experienced significant depression or whatever. And they say things like, I just don't feel like I have the energy or the ability to be that version of myself or to see things in a certain way. This depression is so debilitating that it's really clouding how I see things. How do you respond to that if we have put so much stock into agency being a part of perspective?
Well, I think that's the beautiful thing about perspective is it doesn't matter what the obstacles are or even the perceived obstacles to executing some plan, because we're not even talking about a plan. We're talking about just how you are perceiving something. And so I think that's why in those kinds of situations in therapy, it feels kind of like sometimes we'll push those obstacles to the side. We'll say, okay, those are real valid concerns. Maybe you don't have the energy. Maybe you're in the midst of some really deep depression. Something is just zapping you of your ability to do things. But if we kind of slid that to the side for a bit and said, if you did have the energy, and then now we're getting into that perspective of how they would look at things, how they would approach things, should they be some other version of themselves. And I think that allows us the access to this choice and this perspective that we're talking about without even having to figure out, to me, that other thing feels like strategizing about the obstacles.
So let me ask a clarifying question, because you said in some sense we can kind of push aside the situation for a minute and we can say, suppose a different version of you did show up. What would your perspective then be? Does that, previously we said, we don't want to ignore something. We don't want to, how does taking that approach not ignore the situation? Does that make sense?
I think the situation is very valid, right? We're all human beings living lives with some factors and degrees of difficulty mixed into them. And I think that in some sense has to be part of the equation, of course. But if we're looking at acquiring the perspective that is relevant to being the version of someone, that perspective, I think, is it moves through obstacles. It doesn't matter what the obstacles are. And I think a good example of how the obstacles don't matter is because the context itself isn't relevant to the perspective that you hold. We were just talking earlier about the study of the Olympic athletes who, if you're a medal winner in the ceremony and you see that I think in the study they saw satisfaction was really high in the people who won gold, obviously, but it was similarly high in the people who won bronze. They were happy to be there. They felt like they had just, beat the cusp of what it took to be an Olympic medalist. But then you surprisingly saw a dip in satisfaction in the people who were in second place. And I think that's a great example of how the context isn't as directly tied to how happy we think we should be with the situation. You would probably imagine that someone who's a silver medalist at whatever Olympic sport they've dedicated their life to would be really, really happy with that. But apparently, it's not as correlated as we might think with the exact details of our context.
Yeah, a couple of things stood out to me as you were talking. One is when we were talking about, like, does it ignore the situation if you just kind of jump over to what the perspective that you have? That made me think almost like, if I can get myself to a place where I can think about it and where I can perceive something from a different place, that's going to enable me then to re-engage with potentially whatever it is, but I'm going to re-engage differently. And so in some sense, oftentimes when people come to therapy, we're saying, they're asking, how do I change? I want something to be different. And in some sense, what you're kind of outlining is, if I take a different perspective, that's change, that's difference. Then from that different perspective, you can engage with whatever problem is coming along, but you're going to be viewing yourself differently. You're going to be viewing this situation differently. So that's going to change then how you go about this thing. So that's one thing I think that was really fascinating, is perhaps the change that we're looking for is really just a change within ourselves, a change of our perspective. And then we go about living life despite how difficult it might be.
Yeah. This is, I think, almost tangential, but I think it's still very much on topic with what we're talking about. Our minds are just bias machines, right? Like we are inherently going to grab and hold on to and really dig into some kind of bias for what's normal to us, what's culturally appropriate, what's coherent with our ideas about how things should be or how things are. And so carrying that bias, the world is filtered through that. And so I think one of the most powerful things that therapy does, or any positive experience for someone, is it gives them a filter to use as they're going through their lives. And so these kinds of conversations that we have in therapy, it kind of removes that other filter for a second. It said, if you had this filter on, here's the things that you would get. And I think after a conversation like that, clients have no choice but to hold on to that filter as they're moving throughout their lives. And that's when they begin to see, I think, some of the things that might help them move towards the change they want, rather than feeling stuck in what they were stuck in before. And again, like you said earlier, it didn't change the situation. The filter is just what's in front of their eyes as they're in that situation.
Yeah, that's really fascinating. The other thing that kind of stood out to me as you were talking about, especially like the Olympic medals, right? That people who achieved gold, they viewed themselves almost as like, I am triumphant, right? I've achieved this goal that I've been living my life for this whole time. So I feel happiness, I feel satisfaction. People who achieved bronze, in some sense, had a similar experience of like, I could have been one of those countless people who didn't get a medal, but by the skin of my teeth, I was able to make it in to the circle of triumph. And so they viewed kind of the overcoming in a really similar way. Whereas when you get to silver, it was almost like they're saying, I was so close to being the number one. And I'm disappointed, regardless of how many people I did beat, there's one person who beat me. And so the focus, again, kind of that agency of, they could focus on, I was triumphant with these other two people in beating so many. But the focus shifts to, but I lost to one person. And the power of that one person on my perspective overshadows all of the other people. And I think oftentimes when we get to experiences like trauma or depression or these kinds of things, and I want to be really careful here because I don't want to minimize the gravity of these experiences, but I think the focus is on, I've had this one event in my life, or maybe this repeated experience of an event multiple times. And so the focus gets put on that event or that series of events rather than on lots of times in life where that wasn't happening. Or with depression, I've felt depressed for X amount of time, or this feels particularly bad right now. The focus is on how bad this moment is rather than on other times where maybe it wasn't so bad, or where I was legitimately feeling joy. And so it shifts oftentimes to a minority of time rather than what could be a majority of time. Would you, this is maybe an extreme, but would you say you can choose happiness by where you place your focus?
I would definitely say that. And I think the only hard part about that is feeling like you're allowed to do that, feeling like, becoming aware of that choice existing at all, and then feeling like that's an allowable option for you to do that. And the reason I use the word awareness too is because I think, human beings in general are relatively good problem solvers, but I think that inherently means we're good at finding problems to solve.
Yeah.
And so we linger on what's wrong. We try to go to the root of what's wrong. We stare at our histories and look at all the problems and where things went wrong and all the times we were unhappy and maybe what intensified our unhappiness. All with kind of this sense that I have to do that to get to where I want to be, even though I think to actually get to where you want to be is to say, where do you want to be, and start walking towards that. Start looking for what are the ingredients for becoming that version of yourself. And that's the perspective. That's a choice, I think, is when you start saying, instead of being the problem finder, I think I want to be the kind of person who is looking for what actually would comprise a very satisfying life. And I think every single instance of any person's life is you'll find that you have some of those ingredients already.
Yeah, I really like the way you said that. And the kind of phrase that went through my mind, you said we can either be problem finders and it sounded like something that could easily fit into that is like a future builder, right? So exactly. I may not even know quite the components of what I want my future to be yet, but if I focus on the future, if I think about the future, if I perceive what kind of version of myself I want to be, I can build that future, and I don't have to find any problems. I can just focus on being a future builder, and that could breed a lot of happiness, regardless of whatever problems might have existed previously.
Yeah, exactly. Well, I think in a relatively short time period, we've said a lot of significant things. Is there anything else you throw in to tie that together?
No, I was going to say no, and then I was going to add something. So I suppose the answer is yes. I just one other thing I think is this might take effort, right? The way that we're talking about it is like, you just have this choice, just choose this thing. And I think we are also creatures of habit, right? And the things that we do, we tend to get better and better at doing them. And because so many of us have been problem finders and problem solvers, we've gotten really good at viewing the world in that way, of behaving in that kind of a way. And the shift that we're saying of like being a future builder, being a chooser of happiness, that might take work. It'll take consistent effort and dedication. There will probably be times where we fall back into what feels comfortable, what feels normal to us. So I don't think we want to send the message of like, this is easy, just choose to be happy. I think it might be hard, but the choice is still a choice we have to make.
Yeah, and what I would add on to that is, like you're saying, we're not minimizing the problems that people have. In fact, we could talk all day about the problems that exist and how real and valid and really unfortunately powerful those problems are. But I think what we're saying is so true, because not that the problems are really small, but that our perspective, our minds are that powerful. For us to look at something in a certain kind of a way is so powerful that it makes the context matter less.
Yeah. I think that's a really powerful way to kind of wrap this up, and I think give lots of people time to stew about it. Because I think to hear you say, like, our minds really are that powerful, I think that extends even one step further, is like, we really are that powerful. We can change our perspective. We can change what we choose to focus on. And like the title of this series, right? There's so many possibilities that open up when we harness that power of choosing how we're gonna how we're going to show
Yeah.
up in a situation.
Yeah. And that's the exciting part is, well, what if, you did, who knows what's in the way or why you
Mhm.
can't, but if you did, those possibilities, that's the exciting part.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thanks for this great
Thank
conversation.
you.
This actually went in a really different way than I was expecting, but I think a really powerful way. And so if you have liked what you've heard here today, if you have comments about what you've heard, please let us know. Send us a message, but also like and share it. If you know people who could benefit from viewing perspective in this way, send them the link for this. Like this message, or like this video. Tell us what you think. We really want to know. As we think about future content, we also want to know what you think would be valuable for us to consider.
Yeah.
So engage with us. Let us know what you think.